Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's press conference. The format's going to be one question, one follow-up, and if you could please raise your hand or write to the chat, I will call on you for a question. And with that, over to you, Steven.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much, Will. I have a couple of things to say off the top this morning, and then, of course, as always, we'll open it up for any questions that you might have. So, first of all, I want to talk about what we have seen over the last couple of days from the Ford government relating to their plan, their half-hearted plan for a return to schools for this coming September. Over the last number of weeks, I've had the chance to be in regular contact in all parts of Ontario with moms and dads, with frontline education workers. And you all know, because I talk about this repeatedly, my wife and I have two daughters. One's now heading into grade 9 in a few weeks, the other in grade 5 in the publicly funded system. And, I have to say, looking at what Doug Ford's government announced yesterday, there is such a deep sense of disappointment and betrayal from people right across this province, and understandably so. That the plan that they put forward for September's reopening of our schools makes it clear that Doug Ford has not learned any of the lessons, in particular, as it relates to publicly funded education, the lessons he should have learned throughout this pandemic. The fact of the matter is, he and his team continue to underestimate how difficult last school year was for all of our kids and for all of our frontline workers in education, and for moms and dads like myself and my wife. Not significant funding set aside, for example, for new funding set aside for mental health challenges, kids with special needs who need to be set up for success, class sizes, the hard cap that Ontario Liberals called for in class sizes of 20, so that our kids could get the kind of in-classroom instruction that they need. And the $25 million they talked about yesterday to deal with HEPA filters, everybody has been commenting on that. Where was that move? Where was that leadership such that it is months ago, instead of just a few weeks before the school year is set to begin again? I know that right across this province, the 2 million kids who attend schools in our publicly funded system, their moms and dads, their families, and frontline education workers, we were all holding out hope that Doug Ford would recognize that this is one of his most profoundly important responsibilities, to get publicly funded education right. And again, he's shown up with a half-hearted plan that's completely full of half measures, because he either doesn't care, he doesn't understand, he doesn't have the capacity, or he doesn't really truly grasp that this is something that we collectively, and he in particular, has a responsibility to get right. So deeply, deeply disappointing. Ontario Liberals will continue to push as aggressively as we can, because, as I always say, it's never the wrong time to do the right thing. Aggressively push in order to make sure that Doug Ford does do the right thing and make the proper investments so that we get September right. The second thing I want to talk about is another issue. I raised this over a week and a half ago. This is the concept of mandatory vaccinations for frontline healthcare and education workers. In addition to that, the mandatory certificate, the standardized province-wide mandatory certificate that I believe we need here in Ontario. I said this over a week and a half ago. I just want to repeat, this is the right thing to do. It is reasonable, it is responsible. And again, when you consider for a moment everything that the people of Ontario have been through for the last 17 months, tragically too many lives lost, families torn apart and shattered, businesses closed forever, surely reasonable and responsible leadership would suggest that you have to use every single tool in your toolkit, everything you've got available, to make sure that you are protecting the people of this province, that you're able to keep our schools, our hospitals, and our economy open and being prosperous and being healthy, and having everyone in this province, again, truly set up for success. We have now seen for days and days and days, that Doug Ford refuses to do the right thing when it relates to mandatory vaccinations for frontline education and healthcare workers and the vaccine certificate. And what we've witnessed over just the last few days, again, something that I know has been deeply disappointing and discouraging to progressive voices right across this province, is the sorry spectacle of witnessing Andrea Horwath and the NDP team up with Doug Ford and the Conservatives to try to appease that anti-vaxxer element that we have in this society of ours. To me, that is something I didn't expect to see. I don't know what advice Andrea Horwath and the NDP are getting on this, but it's wrong. And it's not leadership, and it's not what we need at this point in time. Over the last 17 months, over the last 3 years, I've come to expect a certain low standard from Doug Ford. I didn't expect this from Andrea Horwath, and it's a real shame. But again, as I said a second ago, it's never the wrong time to do the right thing. So I am sincerely hopeful that both Doug Ford and Andrea Horwath will realize, they'll talk to proper experts, they'll listen to the science table, they'll respect the knowledge that we have and the experience that we have at that science table and elsewhere. And they'll do the right thing. And we will move forward with mandatory vaccinations for frontline education workers, for frontline healthcare workers, not to be punitive. I don't want anyone to lose their job, but it's the right thing to do. And I say that because when I think about my own daughters heading off to school in just a few weeks, the fact that my wife and I will have no clue who or how many in their school will have received both doses of the vaccine, to me just makes no sense whatsoever. My parents, who are getting just a little bit older, if I was to take my dad, for example, to a doctor's appointment next week, to not know in his relatively speaking vulnerable state whether or not his doctor has received both doses of the vaccine, after everything we've been through, it's not too much to ask. It is responsible, it is reasonable, it is competent, it is compassionate. It is the kind of thing that we need our leaders to do at this critically important moment. I will continue to push for this. I will continue to tell Doug Ford and Andrea Horwath they're both wrong about how we're going to get through. If there has to be a fourth wave, as I said repeatedly, I want it to be as minimal as possible. So let's do the right thing. Let's stop the finger pointing. Let's stop the fighting. Let's deal with this in the most appropriate way possible. And let's show the people of Ontario that we can work together and deliver responsible and reasonable leadership. Thank you so much. And I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Okay, I'm going to begin with the hands raised. And the first question is Colin DeMello from CTV Toronto.
Hi, good morning, Stephen. I first wanted to ask about Dr. Nathan Stahl, who's going to be one of your candidates at Toronto St. Paul's. There is obviously some concern that he is still a member of the Ontario Science Advisory Table, providing advice on the pandemic. Of course, he has a lot of expertise. There's no one doubting that. But the question here is, are you okay with him continuing to provide advice to the government on this when he's clearly going to be running and representing the Ontario Liberal Party in the next election?
So thanks so much for the question, Colin. First of all, let me say I am absolutely thrilled that someone with the experience and the stature and the knowledge, someone who's literally been on the front lines throughout this pandemic alongside his colleagues in health and in medicine and in science, the fact that he's made the decision that he wants to get involved and he stepped forward to run for the Ontario Liberal Party, I think is great news. I mean, it's great news for the Ontario Liberal Party, but it's also really good news for all of us in Ontario. And I say that because when I was talking just a second ago about listening to the science and respecting knowledge and expertise, this is something we have to recapture in this province of ours, which over the last number of years, we've seen to lose a little bit of. This notion that we do have people, women and men, who have the knowledge, who have the expertise, who can give the guidance, and we have to know what we don't know. Something Doug Ford and Andrea Horwath don't seem to be able to admit, what they don't know. I know what I don't know. And I'm not a doctor, and I don't have a scientific background. So the fact that Nathan has stepped forward, I think, is good news. And I hope others will step forward to seek office, those women and men who have expertise for my party, but frankly, for all parties. On the second part of your question about the science table, my understanding is that Nathan has spoken directly with the science table leadership. They are quite comfortable with this notion of him continuing to provide his advice as a volunteer to the science table. And I don't think that we as Ontarians should want to lose his expertise and to lose that strength that he brings to the advice that's being provided to the government. And I suspect the advice will continue to be consistent with the advice he and the others have given all the way along. So I will defer to the leadership of the science table. But again, I am just absolutely thrilled that Nathan, and I hope others like him will step forward to run for all parties, because we need to recapture our ability to respect and listen to expertise, to advice, and to knowledge.
Follow up?
Okay, I understand that. But I mean, science is obviously supposed to be apolitical. Now you have a person who has openly declared a political allegiance to the Ontario Liberals, now providing advice on something that is supposed to be nonpartisan. That seems to be a bit of a conflict of interest. So, what is to prevent Mr. Stahl from injecting some of your policy objectives for the next election into this science advisory process?
Well, listen, Colin, I don't think we need to do any extra work to try to chase down conspiracy theories. Nathan has been consistent, like so many others on the science table have been from the very beginning of this pandemic. I have not seen a market departure from any of them, not just him, but from others, including the leadership of that table all the way through. I mean, just imagine for a quick second, if political leadership, if Doug Ford and others had listened to the science table back in February about how quickly Doug chose to reopen when they were telling him not to, just imagine how much less damage, how much less heartbreak, how much less tragedy would have been inflicted on the people of Ontario with respect to the third wave that was far more brutal than it needed to be because the current provincial government wasn't listening to science. So look, if the leadership of the science table is comfortable with Nathan continuing as a volunteer to give his advice, then again, as I said earlier about mandatory vaccinations for healthcare and education workers, we need every toolkit available to us in the fight through the rest of this pandemic. So delighted he stepped forward to run for us. If the leadership of that table wants to continue to seek his input as a volunteer, he has the respect of his colleagues. I'm perfectly fine with that. If that changes, we'll deal with it in that moment in time.
Okay, the next question is Jeff Gray from the Globe and Mail.
Hi, thanks, Stephen. Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks.
I wanted to go back to the mandatory vaccination piece.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you just explain the policy in a little more detail? Because
Sure.
you say that vaccinations would be mandatory, but then you say no one would lose their job. So what happens to me if I say, nope, I don't like the vaccine, I'm not getting it, and I'm a healthcare worker or education worker? What happens to me?
Yeah. So as I said, when I first announced this, I don't want it to be punitive. It doesn't need to be punitive. I don't want anybody on the front lines to lose their jobs. In those unique circumstances where an individual has a grave concern about the vaccine, I think there are ways dealing with their employers, if they happen to be represented by a union, working with their union leadership to help get them to a good place on the vaccine. In an absolute worst case scenario, if that's just not doable, I think there are ways for us to talk about redeployment so that particular worker isn't necessarily patient facing or student facing. I think there's lots of tools that we have in our toolkit. I didn't stress this in my opening today, but I will now. This policy that I'm strongly in favor of, and I'm the only political leader in Ontario pushing for it currently, this notion of mandatory vaccinations for healthcare and education workers, I want that to respect the Human Rights Code as well. And I said this from day one. There are people who have pre-existing medical conditions, and I get that. And there are ways to deal with that. What I don't accept, what I'll never accept, is that just because the situation is challenging, when it's the right thing to do, when you're in leadership, you don't just throw up your hands and say, well, that's too tough. And I don't want to tick anybody off. And I don't want to appease that fringe we have in Ontario, the anti-vaxxer fringe that Andrea and Doug seem really content to play into. You got to do the right thing. And if there's going to be a fourth wave, and it seems like there's going to be a fourth wave, I want it to be minimal. I want everyone to be kept safe. I want my kids to be safe in school. I want my parents to be safe when they go see their doctors. I want everybody to be safe in this province. And there are ways to get through the challenges we might encounter, but shying away from real leadership is not an acceptable path forward.
Follow up?
Sure, yeah, and just to follow up on that, I mean, the policy that the NDP did announce is supposed to mirror the University Health Network's policy, which is get vaccinated, and if you don't, you got to get tested. It's escaping whether it's every day or every week or whatever it is. Is the University Health Network pandering to the anti-vax fringe, or is that hospital network doing what it thinks is best for its employees?
Yeah, look, I don't think anyone at the University Health Network is running to be premier of this province in 9 months, but I am, and so is Andrea, and Doug's running for re-election, and so is Mike Schreiner. And so I think that there's a certain standard that we need to expect of our leaders when it comes to making tough decisions. I don't want to speak for the University Health Network. I have a ton of respect for the women and men who work there. I suspect that they stepped into the vacuum or the void that was left because Doug Ford decided he wanted to go MIA on this one. And that's fine. Doug has gone MIA throughout the pandemic in so many critically important areas. I don't think there's any progressive Ontarian who truly expected in the last couple of days that Andrea Horwath would continue to team up with Doug and that she would double down on deciding to team up with Doug on this approach. So look, I'm running to be premier. I want to be the next premier of Ontario. I don't want to shy away from tough decisions because I believe that's what the people of Ontario need, especially at this moment.
Okay, the next question is Melissa Candelaria from Your TV Halton.
Hi there. I was just going back to just mandatory vaccines. You talked very thoroughly about your push for mandatory vaccines for frontline and healthcare workers and education workers, but I'm wondering more about the students. It was announced yesterday that students would not be required, much like the other vaccinations that are mandatory. So I just wanted to get your initial thought on that and whether you would push for mandatory vaccines of these students who are eligible.
Yes, I would. So my older daughter, who is going to be turning 14 later this year, has had both of her doses. Again, we've got to trust the science, rely on the medical advice that we get from the women and men who have that expertise. And as I said last week, I am absolutely comfortable with making it mandatory for students, again, eligible students, again, respecting the Human Rights Code, for sure.
And just, I guess, a quick follow-up then so what happens then, what would you see happen for those that are still, there are people who are strongly against this, making mandatory vaccines for students, obviously, because we don't have them. What would you see for those that do kind of push back a little bit and don't want to get the COVID vaccine? What happens to these kids, much like the system that we have already in place?
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's literally what I was just going to say. Look, this is not as groundbreaking as some people want us to believe. This is not as earth-shattering or as different from what we've done in the past. There's a current process that we have in our publicly funded education system to deal with a whole series of required vaccinations. The COVID-19 vaccination should be treated the exact same way.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa.
Okay, the next question is Sinead Dougal from QP Briefing.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
Thanks for taking our questions. I wanted to go back to Ms. Horwath's comments and some of what you mentioned about that regarding mandatory vaccines.
Right.
Specifically, I wanted to get your thoughts on her invoking, charter rights as a reason not to make them mandatory. She said, unlike Steven Del Duca, I don't take lightly people's charter rights. What's your response to that specifically?
Well, listen, I have to say, I think, again, with everything that we've gone through in this province over the last 17 months, with all of the tragedy and all of the heartbreak, and the fact that we all feel like we all want to be so much closer to the end of this crisis, and we want to get through to the other side. I think the very last thing that the people of Ontario need from those of us in positions of leadership is to be glib, to be glib and to not take the issue as seriously, and to have these funny little quips that we want to use from time to time when we're talking about something as serious as mandatory vaccinations. I have so much respect for the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but you need to respect the Charter in its totality. There are reasonable limits that were explicitly put into the Charter to make sure that we are, yes, absolutely, that we absolutely have our freedoms and that we have our rights, but that we have a responsible obligation to one another and a reasonable obligation to one another. And so again, when I think of my daughters heading off to school in a few weeks, grade 9 and in grade 5, or my parents visiting their doctor, I can't believe that anybody reasonable, anybody responsible would say, we don't want to protect everybody. Yes, protect my daughters and my parents, but protect the teachers themselves, the frontline workers themselves in healthcare and in education. So, let's stop the being glib on this. Let's actually have a real conversation. Let's not try to appease small elements of society that are vehemently anti-vaxxer. I get that from Doug Ford. That's kind of his shtick. I didn't expect it from Andrea Horwath. I certainly didn't expect her to team up with Doug and partner with Doug on this. They're both wrong, and the people of Ontario need and deserve better.
Okay. Thank you. And just as a follow-up, like you've suggested, she's pandering to anti-vaxxers. She's invoked the charter here. How much do you think this has to do with the upcoming election and possibly trying, you know, do you think she's trying to appease to unions here? Like what do you kind of see as the, I guess, potential strategy behind the stance that the NDP is taking?
Well, listen, I'm not going to comment on Andrea Horvath's approach to strategy or whatever her team's advice is to her. I mean, that she's best positioned to answer those questions. I will just say, look, I'm on the side of the people of Ontario who want us to be responsible, want us to be reasonable, want us to say, for sure, we respect everyone's rights. There are ways to deal with this. I talked about respecting the Human Rights Code as we approach this, but with the number of people who've died during COVID, with the number of businesses that have closed forever, with the way that our economy is just being completely battered. I mean, there are so many nightmarish things that we've all had to go through. And when your science table and your chief medical officer of health and others are talking about, look, there's likely going to be a fourth wave. We all want it to be as minimally disruptive as possible. We need our schools to stay open. We want our hospitals to start dealing with the surgical backlogs. And we want our economy to reopen safely. You need to use every tool in the toolkit. You know, so I can only presume that both Doug and Andrea have decided that there's a small element of society that's vehemently anti-vaxxer, and they somehow want to appease or appeal to that group. I try to respect everybody in this province, but when you are running to be premier, you have to put the health, safety, and the protection of the people of this province as your paramount concern, not your own political self-interest. And that's what I will continue to do.
Okay, the next question is Richard Southern from 680 News.
Hey, morning, Stephen. Did I just hear you say you believe the premier is anti-vax? You think Doug Ford's anti-vax?
No, I said I believe that Doug Ford is, in this case in particular, trying to appeal to that segment of society that's anti-vaxxer.
Why do you think he's doing that? Like, seriously, I mean, why do you think he doesn't want to make it mandatory? Why do you think the education minister wouldn't give us a straight answer on why students shouldn't be mandated? Like, what do you think's going on there?
Well, again, I won't comment on other political parties' strategies or their approaches. I do think there is I'll say at a philosophical level within Ontario's Conservative Party, there's an element that is being particularly upset with the need to deal with lockdowns and protect the people of this province. That is very much on the record. Many of you have covered it. It's all over social media. And I suspect that 9 months out from an election campaign, that Doug and his political team, his campaign team, have done the calculus, and they've decided that trying to secure the votes of that fringe element of Ontario is more important than my kids' safety or my parents' safety or your kids or your parents' safety. And that's just something that I will not accept, and I will continue to fight against. That's for Doug. It's just, again, I got to say, something I never saw coming was that on this issue that Andrea would decide to partner and team up with Doug. I just never saw that one coming.
Well, how can you say she's partnering with the premier?
Because their position in essence is the same.
Finally, what would you say to there's many people out there who point out the fact that the vaccine's only been around for a year or a year and a half, and they feel they have some legitimate concerns about it. What would you say to those people, Stephen?
So I would say my call for mandatory vaccinations is not at all meant to be punitive. I want us to respect the Human Rights Code. I don't think anyone needs to lose their job. There are many, many ways to get us from where we are today to where we need to be. One thing I didn't say in this press conference so far is that we don't even know how many education workers or healthcare workers have gotten both doses of the vaccine because nobody's tracking it. I mean, I don't know about you, but nobody asked me what I do for a living when I went to get both of my doses. So we're not tracking it. We're not measuring it. We don't have a clue. And that's because Doug Ford has been MIA on this one. People have legitimate concerns and they have legitimate vaccine hesitancy, particularly in racialized communities. We got to work with them to get them to a good spot so they get the doses. But just throwing up our hands and saying this is tough, so we're not going to touch it and we're not going to show responsible or reasonable leadership, that's not something that I'm up for. And I will keep pushing to be responsible and reasonable on this one.
Okay, there are no other questions on the line. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.